All right, so Kahnawake, Alan John Rice. I'm the Executive Operations Officer for the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake. So I was tasked with trying to get the election law pushed, go through the CDMP. So we're at that CDMRP process, excuse me. So we're at that point right now where we are going to be reading the law into record. So this is to read the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake election law. I'm joined by two of our TDC members who are selected from the community. So I'll just let them introduce themselves.
I'm Heather Jacobs-White. I am a retired person from up the hill, and I just volunteered to be part of this process.
Douglas Hash, Community Rep, Technical Drafting Committee for Kahnawake, the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake election law. The preamble to the law is, we are the Kahnawake of Kahnawake. We are a community within the Kahnawake Nation and are indigenous peoples who possess a fundamental and inherent right to self-determination given to us by the Creator. We have an inherent Aboriginal treaty rights and other rights and freedoms that are recognized and affirmed in the Constitution Act 1982 and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which include the inherent right to self-government and jurisdiction over our lands, people, and resources. We have consistently and historically asserted both our rights as Indigenous peoples and the rights set out in our treaties with foreign governments. These rights cannot be extinguished, dismissed, or affected without our consent. As part of our inherent and Aboriginal rights of self-government, we have the right to govern ourselves in relation to matters that are integral to our unique culture, identities, traditions, languages, and institutions with respect to our connection to our people, children, land, and resources. We have consistently and historically exercised the right to determine the rules for the selection of our political leadership. This law is an affirmation of our inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights to establish and maintain our own process to nominate and select a political representation of the Kahnawake of Kahnawake. Part 1, generalities, jurisdiction. The jurisdiction under which the law is entitled is more described as a preamble. The law is an exercise of the collective rights of the Kahnawake of Kahnawake to determine the process for nomination and selecting of the political representatives of the Kahnawake of Kahnawake. This law is paramount to This law is paramount and supersedes the laws, regulations, and policies of the Government of Canada and Quebec, or any other government concerning this matter or matters related therefore. The purpose. The law provides the criteria and procedures for nomination and selection of 12-member. You do this.
Yeah, I'll continue. So number 2, the purpose. The law provides the criteria and procedures for the nomination and selection of a 12-member Rajizahayas, that's for council, composed of 11 Rajizahayas and 1 Ohanda Iride and the Rajizahayas. 3, short title. The law may be cited as the MCK election law. 4, definitions. So 4.1. In this law, candidate means a person who has been duly nominated and accepted their nomination, declared their candidacy, and who has been verified as eligible to hold the position of Ohanda Iride, Rajizahayas, or Yajizahayas, Rajizahayas. Criminal offense includes indictable and felony offenses such as homicide, attempted homicide, sexual assault, rape, burglary, robbery, theft, aggravated assault, arson, embezzlement, illegal drug-related offenses, fraud, breach of trust, and any legally recognized jurisdiction. For greater certainty, the term criminal offense includes any conviction for an indictable offense, three summary convictions, offenses committed within a 5-year period, where a guilty plea has been entered into in a court for an offense regardless of a subsequent discharge as sentencing. The 6-year ban from holding office will commence after the last sentence has been served in full. Criminal conviction for tobacco charge, possession, manufacture, or transport will not be considered a criminal offense for the purposes of this law. Election means the election of the Rajtzahayas Council held pursuant to this law and includes the term selection. Election day means the first Saturday in July beginning in 2018 and every 3 years thereafter. Elector means the individual who meets the eligibility criteria set out in section 26.1 of this law to vote in an election. Justice means justice of the peace of the Court of Kahnawake or any other judge appointed pursuant to the Kahnawake Justice Act or its regulations, but excludes an appeal judge appointed pursuant to that act. General Manager of the Office of the Kahnawake Registry means the individual responsible for the effective operations of the Kahnawake Registry or designate. Nomination Day means the date set by the electoral officer on which nominations are received in accordance with the procedures of this law. Nominee means a person who has been nominated but whose eligibility has not yet been verified as a candidate. Nominator means the elector who proposes a person for the position on the Rajtzahayas Council. Ordinarily resident means having lived in Kahnawake for not less than 6 consecutive months prior to the election in question and includes persons who return to Kahnawake on a regular basis from their place of employment, training, or schooling, as well as a person who does not reside in Kahnawake due to housing shortages. Polling location means the physical location and property where the election is held on election day. Rajtzahayas Council means the elected body of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake. Representative means an individual chosen by candidate to attend the polling location on election day, together with the candidate to observe the counting of votes, and must be eligible to vote in the election on election day. Voters list means the list of electors prepared and maintained by the General Manager of the Office of the Kahnawake Registry.
Part 2, Administration of Election. Number 5, Election of Electoral Officer. The electoral officer will be elected by persons who are 18 years or older on the date of the election, who are on the Kahnawake Registry, and who do not currently have their benefits and entitlements suspended. 5.2, applicants must sign a privacy waiver for the purpose of verifying that they meet the eligibility criteria provided in this law. 5.3, the Kahnawake Justice Commission will issue a notice inviting interested persons to submit their candidacies for the position of electoral officer. This will take place not less than 90 days prior to election day. The period during which submissions are received will be 14 days. 5.4. The verification and screening process for the position of electoral officer will be in accordance with procedures established by resolution of the Kahnawake Justice Commission. This process will be completed no later than 15 days after the close of submissions. 5.5. The Kahnawake Justice Commission will forward the names of eligible candidates to the Executive Office, and the Executive Office will publish the names of eligible candidates for the position of electoral officer, as well as the date, time, and place when the election will be conducted. This date may not be less than 60 days before Election Day. Polls will be open for a minimum of 2 consecutive hours. The eligible candidate for the position of electoral officer who receives the highest number of votes will be elected to the position. After the verification and screening process is completed, only one candidate is eligible. That candidate will be elected by acclamation to the position of electoral officer, and no election will be held. 5.8. If after the verification and screening process is completed, no candidate is eligible, the Kahnawake Justice Commission will seek out an eligible candidate and appoint said candidate to the position of electoral officer on a date no less than 60 days before Election Day. Number 6, duties of electoral officer. 6.1. In addition to any other duties provided in the law in accordance to conduct the election in a fair, transparent, and accountable manner, the electoral officer will: A, declare that a vote will be held on election day. B, establish the date for nomination day, which will be at least 30 days before election day, and conduct the nomination and verification process for candidates. C, refuse to accept the nomination of any candidate who is not eligible to hold office or whose nomination does not comply with this law and its regulations. D, arrange for a meeting to be held at least 5 days before election day at which electors may hear the candidates speak. E, Ensure that an adequate supply of this law and regulations are made available to the public at Mohawk Council of Kahnawà offices during the entire electoral process up to and including the election day. F, conduct and supervise the election in accordance with this law and its regulations. G, make any decision and take any reasonable measure that is required to apply this law and the regulations. H, maintain and record in a logbook all problematic events or issues which occur and decisions taken from the time he or she is appointed until the time of official announcement of elected candidates. 6.2, an electoral officer is not entitled to vote in the election for which he or she acts as the electoral officer. 6.3, should the electoral officer fail to perform any duty established by this law or resigns prior to the election, the Kahnawake Justice Commission will appoint an eligible candidate to replace the electoral officer without undue delay.
Section 7, Assistant Electoral Officer and Polling Clerks. 7.1, the electoral officer will appoint for the duration of the election an assistant electoral officer who shall not be the electoral officer's spouse or immediate family member, and one or more polling clerks of whom shall perform the duties assigned to them and as directed by the electoral officer. 7.2, before they are appointed, the potential assistant electoral officer and polling clerks must sign a privacy waiver for the purpose of verifying that they meet the eligibility criteria provided in this law. The assistant electoral officer and polling clerks are entitled to vote in the election for which they have been appointed. The assistant electoral officer will assist the electoral officer in all aspects of the election as directed by the electoral officer. 7.5, electoral clerks will perform the duties assigned to them by this law and its regulations and will assist the electoral officer in scrutinizing the processes and results of the vote and will perform such duties as directed by the electoral officer.
Section 8, eligibility requirements. 8.1, the electoral officer, assistant electoral officer, and polling clerks must A, be over the age of 21, B, must be on the Kahnawake registry and must not currently have their benefits and entitlements suspended. C, must be ordinarily resident in Kahnawake, and D, must not have within the previous 6 years pled guilty, been found guilty, been convicted, or sentenced for a criminal offense. The 6-year ban commences only after all sentences have been served in full. 8.2, in addition to these eligibility requirements, the electoral officer must also meet the requirements contained in the terms of reference and must have the skills and the experience necessary to conduct an election in a fair, transparent, and accountable manner as evaluated by the Kahnawake Justice Commission. 8.3, no person may be appointed to act in any capacity related to the election process who was a member of the Redzidahayas at any time during the year immediately preceding the election or who is or intends to be a candidate in the election. Section 9, remuneration and budget. 9.1, the electoral officer, assistant electoral officer, and polling clerks are to be remunerated for duties performed. 9.2, an adequate budget will be allocated by the Executive Office of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake. The budget must include adequate funding to conduct an election under this law. The electoral office is responsible for the management and accountability of these funds in accordance with the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake's administration standards and the roles and responsibilities set forth in their contract.
Part 3, elections. Number 10, general. 10.1, there will be an election held every 3 years for the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, which is a 12-member Redzidahayas council composed of 11 Redzidahayas and 1 Ohondu Iande, Ohondu Irade, ne Redzidahayas. The election will be held on election day. 10.3, the positions of Ohondu Iande, Ohondu Irade, ne Redzidahayas, and Redzidahayas are filled by the candidates receiving the highest number of votes. Number 11, terms of office. 11.1, the term of office of the Ohondu Irade, Ohondu Irade, ne Redzidahayas, and each Redzidahayas, Yetzahayas will be 3 years. 11.2, there is no limitation on the number of terms of office A. Ohondo iande, Ohondo iradene radizahayas, or Ratzahayas, yet Zahayas may serve. Number 12, who can hold office? 12.1. To be eligible to hold the office of Ohondo iande, Ohondo iradene radizahayas, or Ratzahayas, yet Zahayas, a person, A, must be on the Kahnawake registry and must not currently have their benefits and entitlements suspended. B, must have 50% or more blood quantum. C, must be of Kahnawake and not of any other Kahnawake community. D, must not be married to or living common law with a non-native person. E, must be a minimum of 21 years of age. F, must be ordinarily resident. G, must declare all their private business holdings and purpose of which is to verify conflicts of interest if elected and or respond to public inquiry of the Ohondo iade, Ohondo irade, ne razizahayas, and ratzahayas, yet zahayas. H, must not have, within the previous 6 years, pled guilty, been found guilty, been convicted, and or sentenced for a criminal offense. The 6-year ban commences only after all sentences have been served in full. I, must not have been removed from the office as Ohondo iade, Ohondo irade, ne razizahayas, or ratzahayas, yet zahayas, if served in the term immediately before the current election. And J, must be willing to submit to, then pass a test for illegal drugs after being elected to the position of Ohondo iade, Ohondo irade, ne razizahayas, or ratzahayas, yet zahayas.
Number 13, nomination procedure. 13.1, the electoral officer will set the date of nomination day, which will be not less than 30 days before election day. Not less than 7 days before nomination day, the electoral officer will post notice of date and time and place for the purpose of nominating candidates for the election. The notice will indicate the procedures for nominating candidates as provided in this law and its regulations. Nominations of candidates will be held between the hours of 10 and 12 in the morning, 10 a.m. to 12 noon on nomination day. Nominations will not be accepted after the close of nomination period. Any two nominators may nominate and second any person eligible to hold office as a candidate for the position of Ohondo iade, Ohondo irade de Ratzahayas, or Ratzahayas Yadzahayas. An elector can participate in a maximum of 2 nominations. For further clarity, an elector may nominate one individual for the position of Ohondo iade, Ohondo irade de Ratzahayas, or Ratzahayas Yadzahayas, and or second a nomination for one individual for the position of Ratzahayas Yadzahayas, but cannot second and nominate for the same position. In order to be valid, a nomination must be made on the nomination form prescribed by the regulation and duly completed by nominators nominating and seconding the candidate and submitting to the electoral officer before the close of the nomination period. Upon receipt, the electoral officer will sign the nomination form acknowledging the receipt and will provide copies to the person submitting the form. A second nomination, if any, must be presented by 2 other nominators. A person may be nominated for Ohondo iade, Ohondo irade, Ratzahayas, Yadzahayas, or both. A candidate can only run for one position and must clearly indicate for which position they intend to run by their declaration of candidacy. After 12 noon on nomination day, the electoral officer will announce names of all the nominees without unreasonable delay and will provide a copy of this law and regulations to each nominee. The announcement of the names of nominees by the electoral officer at the close of the nomination period does not qualify or any particular nominee as a candidate. Each nomination is subject to the verification procedures set out in this law and its regulations. Section 14, verification procedure. Within 3 days of the close of nomination period, each nominee must duly complete and submit to the electoral officer each of the following statements in the form which will be prescribed by the regulation. A, declaration of candidacy. B, declaration of eligibility. C, declaration of criminal offense charge pending. D, declaration of business holdings, and this declaration will be made available to any elector who wishes to see it prior to the election day. E. Privacy waiver, failing which the nomination will become null and void. The privacy waiver provided by each nominee is for the sole purpose of authorizing the electoral officer to conduct such inquiries and obtain such information, the verification information, as it is required to verify the nominee's eligibility to hold office of Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas, or Ratzahayas Yatzahayas. Except as provided in this law, the electoral officer will hold the verification information in the strictest confidence and will not copy the information or provide it to any person other than the nominee at his or her request. Following the close of nomination period, the electoral officer will review each nomination to verify whether the nomination is valid or whether the nominee meets the criteria for persons eligible to hold office of Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas, or Ratzahayas Yatzahayas as set out in this law. Within 7 days after the close of nomination period, the electoral officer will contact each nominee to advise whether their nomination has been accepted or refused. The acceptance of a nomination by the electoral officer qualifies the nominee as a candidate for election. The electoral officer may refuse a nomination, A, that person has that has been improperly filled, B, filed, sorry. So the electoral officer may refuse a nomination, A, that has been improperly filed, B, that has inaccurate, misleading, or incomplete, or C, that is otherwise invalid. In the event the nomination is refused, the electoral officer will specify the reason for the rejection. The electoral officer will, without unreasonable delay, post a public notice listing the names of the candidates for positions of Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas, and Nerezizahayas. In the event of that more than one Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas is nominated and verified as a candidate, and more than the required number of Nerezizahayas are nominated and verified as candidates, the electoral officer will declare that an election would be held for these positions on election day. Where immediately before the close of nomination period there is an insufficient number of nominees to fill all positions on Nerezizahayas, the electoral officer will declare that the first nomination period adjourned and will reopen the nomination period for a second session 2 days later. No nomination period will consist of more than 2 sessions.
Number 15, withdrawal of candidacy. 15.1. The withdrawal of a candidate's candidacy must be in the form of a sworn statement and signed in the presence of the electoral officer or a commissioner of oaths. The sworn statement must be addressed to the attention of the electoral officer and must contain a statement to the effect that the candidate freely and voluntarily withdraws their candidacy from the election. The sworn statement must be received by the electoral officer before the hour of 12 p.m. on the Wednesday immediately preceding the election day. If the ballots have already been printed at the time of the withdrawal of a candidacy, the electoral officer will cause the name of the withdrawing candidate to be blackened out, and notices of the candidacy's withdrawal will be posted in conspicuous locations within the Mohawk territory of Kahnawake and at the polling location. Gain 3. If after a candidate withdraws, there remains only one candidate for the Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas, or the remaining number of candidates for the Nerezizahayas is equal to the number to be elected, the electoral officer will declare those candidates elected by acclamation. 16. Election by acclamation. 16.1. Election by acclamation is declared if there is only one candidate to serve as Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas. The electoral officer will declare the election uncontested and further declare the candidate duly elected. If the number of candidates to serve as Nerezizahayas is equal to the number of positions required, the electoral officer will declare the elections uncontested and further declare the candidates duly elected. 16.3. The term of office for a Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade Nerezizahayas, or Ratzahayas Yatzahayas, who is elected by acclamation, will begin immediately upon the end of the incumbent council's term of office as defined in section 30.2 of this law. 16.4. If the Ohandu Iande, Ohandu Irade ne Radzahayas, and 11 Radzahayas are all elected by acclamation, then their term of office will begin immediately upon the end of the incumbent council's term of office as defined in section 30.2 of this law.
Part 4, Section 17, preparation of the poll. The electoral officer will prepare and manage the poll in accordance with the rules prescribed by regulation. The form and composition of the ballot will be prescribed by regulations. Section 18, polling location. The electoral officer and the assistant electoral officer will provide compartments at the polling station where electors can mark their ballots in privacy and free from observation from any other person, except as specified provided in this law. Not more than one elector will be permitted in the vicinity of the polling compartment at any one time. The electoral officer may request one or more officers of the Kahnawake peacekeepers to be present at the polling location to aid in the maintenance and peace and order of the election. Any person who, by reason of intoxication or other conduct affecting peace and order of the election will be required to leave the polling location, and the rights to vote in that election will be forfeited. The electoral officer will ensure that no person blocks the entrance or hinders access to the polling location. The electoral officer will ensure that no partisan election campaigns advertising will be present at the polling location. The electoral officer will ensure that no fundraising activities will occur at the polling location. Section 19, election procedures. The poll will be kept open between 9 a.m. in the morning and 6 p.m. in the evening, local time, on election day. Each person who presents himself or herself for the purpose of voting will state his or her name at the polling clerk, and if satisfied as to the identity of the elector and the name of the elector is entered onto the voting list at the polling location, the polling clerk will initial the back of a ballot, provide it to the elector in order to cast his or her vote. The polling clerk will verify that person is eligible. The polling clerk will verify that the person is an eligible elector held in the electoral. The polling clerk will verify the person is an eligible elector, hand the elector a ballot, and register the elector as having voted once the ballot is returned. If the polling clerk has reason to believe that the person requesting the vote is not an elector, has already voted, or is falsely representing himself or herself, the polling clerk will refuse the elector. No. Refer. If the polling clerk has reason to believe that the person requesting a vote is not an elector and has already voted, or is falsely misrepresenting himself or herself, the polling clerk will refer the elector to the electoral officer who will determine whether the person is entitled to vote.
Section 20, voters list. The general manager of the office of the Kahnawake Kanien'kehá:ka Registry will not less than 1 week before election day prepare the voters list that will be used for the selection of the Redzahayas or Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade, ne Redzahayas. The voters list will consist of the names of all electors. Section 21, voting. An elector will cast a ballot in accordance with the process for making and depositing a ballot as prescribed by regulation. All ballots cast on election day will be done at the polling location. No off-site voting will be permitted. In the event of a perceived error on the voting list on polling day, or in the event that an elector's name has been inadvertently omitted, the elector may request the electoral officer to make a correction. Where a person's name is not included on the voters list, the electoral officer and the assistant electoral officer will immediately make such inquiries as are necessary to confirm whether the person is an elector and is eligible to vote. Only after such confirmation will the person be given a ballot and permitted to vote. The electoral officer or assistant electoral officer should refer a person to the representatives of the office of the Kahnawake Registry to clarify why that person is not on the voters list. Every elector who is inside the building being used, every elector who is inside the building being used as a polling location at the time fixed for closing poll will be entitled to vote. Section 22, a special poll. The electoral officer will hold one or more special polls not more than 10 days prior to election day. The special poll is for the purposes of receiving votes of electors who are expected to be unable to cast their votes on election day. For purposes and clarity, special polls will be held at senior and healthcare institutions so that residents may cast their vote. The electoral officer may, upon a request, visit the homes of electors who cannot leave their residence due to medical restrictions. A special poll will also be held for the electors who are unable to cast their votes on election day due to other reasonable circumstances, including work schedules. Should a candidate withdraw his or her candidacy prior to election day, but after the date of a special poll, the ballots cast in the special poll remain valid, other than any votes cast for the withdrawing candidate, which will be determined null and void. The special poll will be located at a convenient central location in the Mohawk territory of Kahnawake and will be open for at least 2 consecutive hours at the discretion of the electoral officer. Notice of a special poll will be given at least 7 days in advance and will include reference to the date, time, and place of the special poll.
23, voting at a special poll. 23.1, voting at a special poll will be conducted in the same manner as voting on election day, with such modifications or adaptation of this law or applicable regulations as the electoral officer deems necessary. 24, criteria for voting in a special election. 24.1, the electoral officer may, at his or her discretion, approve a request from elector to cast a ballot in a special poll if A, a written request is received by electoral officer at least 72 hours before the time of a special poll, and B, the reasons for the request are deemed by the electoral officer to be satisfactory. 24.2, without limiting the discretion of the electoral officer, some possible reasons for a person to cast a ballot in a special poll include hospitalization, education, training or employment commitments, or a physical handicap. Section 25, special poll ballots and special poll lists. 25.1, all ballots cast at a special poll will be retained in a locked ballot box and remain in a secure location and in the legal possession of the electoral officer until the close of the poll on election day. 25.2, the electoral officer will maintain a list of electors who have voted at a special poll. The electoral officer will direct the general manager of the office of the Kahnawake Registry to remove the names of these electors from the voters list prior to election day. 26, eligibility to vote. 26.1, subject to other provisions of this law, to be eligible to vote in an election, including a special poll, an elector, A, must be on the Kahnawake Registry and must not currently have their benefits and entitlements suspended, and B, must be at least 18 years of age on election day.
Section 27, polling day duties. The polling clerk will record all specific, and the polling clerk will record in a specific log any problems encountered with electors or the persons or other persons and any decisions of the electoral officer. The electoral officer and assistant electoral officer or polling clerk will explain the voting procedure to any elector at his or her request. The electoral officer will ensure that no partisan election campaign advertising can be seen at the polling location and ensure no persons entering a polling location with such advertising displayed. The electoral officer will ensure that no fundraising is done at the polling location, including the grounds surrounding the premises. Part 5, post-election. Section 28, counting the votes. After the closing of the poll on election day, the electoral officer or assistant electoral officer will see that all the persons see to it that all persons vacate the polling place, with the exception of the polling clerks, the on-duty Kahnawake peacekeepers, candidates who wish to attend the counting of the votes, and one representative for each candidate. The rules concerning preparation of any counting stations for the purpose of counting and rejecting votes will be prescribed by regulation.
29, recount of votes. The electoral officer will recount the votes for a position to be filled at a Zahayas election. A, where it appears that two or more candidates have an equal number of votes and an additional vote would entitle one person to be elected. Or B, at the request of an affected candidate where there are 10 or less votes separating a candidate who is elected and a candidate who is not elected. The electoral officer will organize and supervise a recount of the ballots affecting the election, which may be attended by any candidate and their representative. A recount should take place immediately at the polling location, and if after a recount one or more candidates are still not satisfied, a second recount should be made, or even a third, depending on the circumstances. The electoral officer will, in his or her sole discretion, decide when the number of recounts has been satisfactory for the purpose. The electoral officer, candidates, and candidates' representatives will have the right to request a recount of any of the candidates' votes. A candidate or representative cannot refuse a recount. Where after two or more recounts of votes, there exists an equal number of votes for each of the two or more candidates for a position, the electoral officer will, within 7 days of the election, hold a second poll for those candidates for that position with such modification or adaptation of this law as the electoral officer deems necessary. If for any reason a recount of the votes is requested after the day on which the poll was held, the request must be made in writing by one or more candidates for the electoral officer within 48 hours after the poll closed. A recount will take place within 7 days. Section 30, declaration of poll results. Immediately after the completion of and the counting of votes, the electoral officer and the assistant electoral officer will tabulate the results and will publicly declare to be elected the candidates having the highest number of votes. The newly elected legislators' term of office will begin upon their swearing of oath in office within 1 week after the election results are made public, at which time the incumbent legislators' term of office will end. In the event of a recount, the unaffected candidates will be declared elected and the electoral officer will report to the community the results of the recount. Section 31, election materials. The electoral officer will have the legal possession and will retain and safeguard all election materials used in the election, including ballots, any ballot boxes, voters lists, poll logs, and a report of the election results for a period of 14 days after the election day. At 14 days after election day, the electoral officer will remit to the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake all material used in the election except the ballots, if any, which would be destroyed by the electoral officer in the presence of two witnesses who will make a declaration that they witnessed the destruction of the ballots. In the event of an appeal, the electoral officer will not destroy any ballots until such time that the decision has been rendered. All other documents related to the election will be retained for a period of 2 weeks. No electoral officer, assistant electoral officer, or polling clerk will divulge any information obtained to them, to him or her, with respect to the conduct of an election, except in the case of legal proceedings respecting the election.
Section 32, pre-election reviews. Pre-election reviews will be decided by a justice on a priority basis. The justice will have jurisdiction to hear requests for pre-election reviews until the polls close on election day. The justice may only review a pre-election decision taken by the electoral officer with respect to A, a candidate's eligibility to run in the election or to hold office. B, compliance with nomination procedures. C, application or non-application of a provision of the election law or its regulations. D, an elector's eligibility to vote. E, a community member's eligibility to be on the voters list. Or F, any other decision taken by the electoral officer prior to the closing of the polls on election day. Requests for review of a decision of the electoral officer will be made by completing the review form established by Justice Services and submitting it to the Court of Kahnawake. Submission will be made by one of the following methods. A, in person at the offices of the Court of Kahnawake. B, bailiff. C, registered mail. D, facsimile, fax, transmission, or E, any other way that reasonably ensures proof of reception. The review will be decided as expediently and as possible and in such a manner as to not hinder the election process. Requests for review of a decision of the electoral officer on election day will be submitted to the clerk of the Court of Kahnawake, who will be available to receive such requests. The justice who reviews the electoral officer's decision has discretion on the procedure used to determine the review, provided said procedure is expedient and will not hinder the election process. The justice's decision with respect to any pre-election review is final and is not subject to further appeal.
Section 33, post-election appeals. The appeal procedures set out in this section apply in any manner related to a Rajitsahayas election. For greater clarity, these appeals do not include any matter which relate to pre-election reviews and decision pursuant to Section 32.3 of this election law. The appeals will be made by completing the appeal form established by Justice Services and submitting it to the Court of Kahnawake. Submissions will be made by one of the following methods. A, in person at the office of the Court of Kahnawake. B, bailiff. C, registered mail. D, facsimile, fax, transmission, or E, any other way that reasonably ensures proof of reception. Appeals must be submitted not more than 10 days after the election. Appeals must be submitted by any person on the Kahnawake Ganyigahaga registry who has reasonable grounds to believe that A, there was a corrupt practice in connection with the election. B, there was a violation of this law that may have affected the result of the election. Or E, a person elected to the position of Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade in the Rajitsahayas or Ratzayas Yatzayas no longer meets the eligibility criteria set out in this law, or that new facts have come to light in which had they have been known prior, the election would have been rendered prior to the election would have rendered the Ohanda Iade, Ohanda Irade in the Rajitsahayas or Ratzayas Yatzayas ineligible to run for office. Appeals must state the grounds on which the appeal is based and must be accompanied by copies of any documents and the names of any witnesses the appellant believes to be relevant to the appeal. The Court of Kahnawake will, within 7 days of a receipt of an election-related appeal, forward a copy of the appeal together with all related materials by registered mail to the electoral officers and each candidate involved in the election. The electoral officer or any candidate may, within 7 days of receipt of the copy of an appeal, submit to the Court of Kahnawake a written answer to the particulars set out in the appeal, together with any supporting documents and the names of any supporting witnesses, using one of the following methods. A, in person at the office of Court of Kahnawake. B, bailiff. C, registered mail. D, facsimile, fax, transmission. E, or E, any other way that reasonably ensures proof of reception. The Court of Kahnawake will appoint a justice to hear the appeal, and answers, if any, submitted by the electoral officer and candidate. The justice appointed to hear the appeal may decide on the appeal based solely on the written materials that have been submitted, or if the material that has been received is not adequate for deciding an appeal, conduct such as public hearings into the matter as he or she deems necessary. The justice will, after due consideration, decide the merits of the matters raised in the appeal, and order any remedies that may be appropriate. The Court of Kahnawak's decision with reasons will be communicated to the appellant, the electoral officer, and all candidates either in person, or in the matter of proceedings to a hearing in the Court of Kahnawake, or in writing sent by registered mail to each party. The justice will have 15 days to render a decision from the date an appeal is heard, and will have an additional 45 days to render a written judgment. The justice may, in his or her discretion, declare that the results of the election are valid, overturn the election results, or in a overturn the election results in whole or in part to the extent that the violations or wrongdoing affected the results, may order that another election be conducted, or may order that that any other appropriate relief. The justice may, as a part of his or her decision, order any party to an appeal to pay some or all legal expenses incurred by the other party of the appeal. The decision will be made known to the community of Kahnawake. The decision is final and not subject to other appeal. Vacancies in council, section 34. The vacancy of a Yatzayas position due to health, resignation, or removal from office occurring more than 18 months before the election date for Yatzayas will be filled by calling for nominations to fill the vacancy. This should be done 2 weeks following the vacancy. A by-election should be called 2 weeks following the nomination, with such modification or adaptation of this law as the electoral officer deems necessary. The electoral officer in this instance will be appointed by reinitiating the mandate of the electoral officer from the prior election as soon as the by-election is required. If the former electoral officer is unable to conduct the by-election, Kahnawake Justice Commission will seek out and appoint an eligible candidate to oversee the by-election. Should the position of Ohanda Iade or Ohanda Irede Neradzahayas become vacant due to death, resignation, or removal from office 6 months or more before election day, the vacancy must be filled through a by-election. For greater certainty, if a by-election occurs, Yatzayas does not have to resign from their position should they choose to run for the position of Ohanda Iade or Ohanda Irede Neradzahayas.
Part 6, final. Section 35, regulations. The Radzahayas Council may ratify regulations with respect to any matter outlined in this law. Section 36, coming into force. This law comes into force on the day it is enacted by resolution of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake. Amendments, section 37. This law may be amended in accordance with the procedures set forth in the community decision-making process as amended from time to time.
So after that, the reading of the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake election law is complete. Now, for listening, thank you, everybody.